They tell you the night shift is easy money. Just watch the monitors, they say. Nothing ever happens at 3 a.m. They're lying? The truth is, when the sun goes down, the world we know retreats, and something else crawls into the empty spaces we leave behind. I spent 6 months guarding a tomb of concrete and steel, thinking I was alone. I wasn't. And it took a dead phone line and a bricked-up basement to show me that some voices should never be answered. If you're listening to this at work right now, look at your phone. If it rings from an unknown extension, for God's sake, don't pick up. The warehouse was a monument to industrial decay. Located on the desolate fringes of Pennsylvania, the Northeast Logistics Depot was a 5-acre slab of corrugated metal and cold concrete. It was filled with crates that hadn't been moved in decades and shadows that felt heavier than they should. I took the job because I needed the money and I hated people. The night shift offered both. My sanctuary was a small glass-walled booth elevated slightly above the main floor, equipped with 16 low-resolution monitors and a beige, clunky desk phone from the 90s. For the first few months, the silence was my friend. I'd sit there with a thermos of black coffee, watching the grainy feeds of empty hallways and silent loading docks. The only sound was the hum of the industrial HVAC system and the occasional groan of the building settling. I spent my time reading old horror novels, ironically enough, unaware that I was living in one. The air in that place always felt thin, like it was being filtered through a thick layer of dust and forgotten secrets. Sector 9 was the worst part of the building. It was the furthest point from my booth, a long, narrow corridor lined with industrial shelving that reached 30 feet into the dark. The motion-activated lights there were temperamental. They would flicker on for no reason, casting long, distorted shadows that looked like limbs stretching across the floor. I hated doing my rounds in Sector 9, so I usually just watched it on Monitor 12. One rainy Tuesday in November, the atmosphere changed. The rain was lashing against the metal roof with a violence that made the whole building vibrate. At exactly 2:14 a.m., the desk phone jangled. The sound was so jarring in the absolute stillness that I jumped, nearly knocking my coffee onto the monitors. I stared at the small glowing LCD screen on the phone base. I frowned. I had been there 6 months, and I'd never seen a call from 304. Most of the active extensions were in the shipping office, 101 to 110, or the break room, 205. I pulled the laminated yellowing site map from the desk drawer to see where 304 was located. My stomach did a slow, sickening roll. Extension 304 was listed in a section marked Basement Archives. But the basement had been decommissioned in 1998. According to the older guards, it had been bricked off after a massive flood that caused structural damage. There shouldn't be a working phone down there. There shouldn't be anyone there to dial it. I picked up the receiver. "Security, this is Elias," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud to my own ears. Silence, but not the flat silence of a deadline. It was an active silence. I could hear the faint crackling hum of an old copper wire. And then, a sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. It was a rhythmic tapping. Click, click, click. It sounded like a fingernail tapping against a plastic receiver. It was slow, deliberate, and incredibly patient. "Hello? Is someone down there?" I asked. My heart was starting to drum against my ribs. From the other end, a voice emerged through the static. It didn't sound like a human voice. It sounded wet, like someone was trying to speak while their mouth was full of thick, stagnant water. It was a gurgling, distorted whisper. "Elias," the voice said. I froze. My name wasn't on the door. I wasn't wearing a name tag. I was the only person in this 5-acre building, and a voice from a bricked-up basement just said my name. "Who is this? How do you know my name?" I demanded, my hand gripping the receiver so hard My knuckles turned white. The tapping stopped. The gurgling sound grew louder, accompanied by a sound like someone gasping for air while submerged. It's so cold, Elias. The water is so dark. Why won't you open the door? I slammed the phone down. My heart was racing. I sat there for 20 minutes, staring at the phone, waiting for it to ring again. It didn't. But when I looked up at the monitors, I realized something was wrong. Monitor 12, the one covering Sector 9, was no longer showing an empty hallway. The motion lights were all on, blazing with a harsh, flickering white light. And at the very end of the hall, standing right in front of the bricked-up basement door, was a figure. It was too far away to see clearly, but it looked like a woman. She was wearing something dark and long. She wasn't moving. She was just standing there facing the bricks. I told myself it was a prank. One of the day shift guys must have stayed behind to mess with the new guy. I grabbed my heavy maglite and my radio. I had to go to Sector 9. I had to prove to myself that there was a rational explanation for this. As I walked out of the booth and onto the main floor, the silence of the warehouse felt different. It felt heavy, like it was pressing against my eardrums. Every step I took on the concrete floor echoed like a gunshot. I kept my flashlight beam low, cutting through the darkness of the aisles. When I reached the entrance to Sector 9, the air temperature dropped significantly. My breath began to mist in front of my face. I looked down the long corridor toward the basement door. The figure was gone. The hallway was empty, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of the flickering overhead lights. I walked toward the end of the hall, my boots clicking on the floor. When I reached the bricked-up entrance, I stopped. The wall was solid, old red bricks covered in a fine layer of dust. There were no signs that anyone had been there. But then I looked down. On the concrete floor, directly in front of the bricks, was a puddle of water. It wasn't clear water. It was black, oily, and smelled of rot and stagnant pond water. And leading away from the puddle, heading toward the shelves, were a series of wet, bare footprints. They weren't human footprints. The toes were too long, and the arches were unnaturally high. And as I followed them with my flashlight, I realized the tracks didn't stay on the floor. They led to the base of a massive industrial shelf. And then they began to go up. Wet black handprints were smeared on the metal beams, climbing higher and higher into the darkness of the rafters. I stood there, the beam of my maglite trembling as it hit the high rafters. The wet black handprints disappeared into the absolute darkness above the industrial shelving. There was no sound, save for the frantic thumping of my heart and the distant, rhythmic drumming of the rain against the metal skin of the building. I didn't want to look up. Every instinct I had, honed by a lifetime of avoiding trouble, was screaming at me to run. But I was frozen, anchored to the concrete floor by a sickening curiosity. I lowered my light and backed away slowly, my eyes never leaving the ceiling. As I retreated toward the security booth, the silence was broken again. Not by the phone, but by the intercom system. A low-frequency hum vibrated through the air, followed by a burst of static that sounded like teeth grinding together. Elias, why are you hiding? The voice came from the overhead speakers, echoing through the 5-acre expanse. It was that same wet, gurgling tone, but louder now, distorted by the aging amplifiers. I didn't answer. I ran. I bolted back into the glass booth and slammed the door, locking it, even though I knew glass offered no real protection against whatever was climbing in the rafters. I needed answers. I began tearing through the filing cabinets in the back of the booth, folders labeled Maintenance 1990 to 2000. My hands were shaking so violently, I nearly tore the tabs off. Finally, I found a thick manila folder bound with a rusted paperclip. It was labeled. I spread the papers across the desk. There were photos, grainy black and white Polaroids of the basement before it was bricked up. It was a labyrinth of pipes and heavy machinery, half submerged in dark water. The report detailed a catastrophic failure of the primary sump pump during a hurricane. But it wasn't the machinery that caught my eye. It was the name of the victim, Sarah Miller, inventory specialist. The report stated that Sarah had gone down to the archives to rescue a pallet of historical logs during the flood. The heavy steel door had malfunctioned, locking her inside as the water rose. By the time the maintenance crew got the door open 3 days later, the basement was filled to the ceiling. They didn't find her body immediately. The report said she had been lost to the machinery, but a handwritten note in the margin, scrawled in faded blue ink, said something different. "We found her nails embedded in the brickwork near the phone. She was trying to call out until the very end." My breath hitched. Extension 304. She had died in the dark, submerged in freezing water, desperately dialing for a help that never came. And now, 28 years later, she had found someone who finally picked up the phone. Jangle. The desk phone rang. I didn't even look at the caller ID. I knew it was her. I reached out, my fingers hovering over the receiver. I didn't want to answer, but the air in the booth was suddenly heavy with the smell of stagnant water and old copper. I felt a cold, wet pressure against my ear, as if someone were leaning over my shoulder, pressing their face against mine. I picked up. "Sarah?" I whispered. The static on the other end was gone. In its place was a clear, heartbreaking sound, the sound of someone sobbing under a layer of water, a wet, bubbly weeping that seemed to fill the room. "They left me," she gurgled. "The lights went out first, then the water reached my knees. I called and I called. Why didn't they answer, Elias? Why did they brick over me?" "I don't know," I choked out, tears stinging my eyes. "I wasn't here. Sarah, I'm sorry." "I was so thirsty," she whispered, her voice shifting from grief to something much sharper, something predatory. "But there's so much water now. Do you want to see, Elias? Do you want to see where I've been waiting?" Suddenly, the 16 monitors on the desk flickered. They all synced up to the same feed. Sector 9. The camera was vibrating, the image distorted by heavy interference. I saw the figure again. She was no longer on the ceiling. She was standing directly in front of the security booth's glass wall, her back to me. She began to turn, slowly. Her neck cracked with the sound of dry wood snapping. Her hair was a matted, sodden mess that hung down to her waist, dripping that black, oily liquid. As she faced the camera, I saw her face. The skin was translucent, stretched tight over a skull that seemed too large. Her mouth was a jagged dark hole, and her eyes— she had no eyes, just empty weeping sockets that bled gray silt. She raised a long pale finger and pointed, not at the camera, but at the glass of my booth. I looked up from the monitors. She wasn't outside the glass. The floor of the booth was dry. The air was clear. But when I looked at the reflection in the glass, I saw her. She was sitting in the chair right next to me. Her wet dress was draped over the armrest. Her long yellowed fingernails were inches away from my throat. Click, click, click. She began tapping her nails against the metal frame of my chair. The sound was deafening in the small space. I tried to scream, but my throat felt like it was filled with cold mud. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by the sheer freezing weight of her presence. "Open it," she whispered into my ear, her breath smelling of salt and rot. "Open the basement, Elias. Let the water out. Or I'll let the water into you." At that moment, the overhead lights in the warehouse exploded one by one, a chain reaction of shattering glass and sparks that raced from Sector 1 all the way to Sector 9. The entire building was plunged into a darkness so thick it felt like a physical weight. In the dark, I heard the sound of the booth's sliding door creaking open. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light. It was a physical presence, cold and smelling of stagnant river water. My breathing came in ragged, shallow gasps. I stood frozen in the center of the security booth, the shattered glass crunching beneath my boots like breaking bone. I didn't need light to know she was there. I could hear the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of oily water hitting the floor, and that relentless, maddening tapping. Click, click, click. I fumbled for my maglite, my fingers numb and clumsy. When the beam finally cut through the blackness, it flickered weakly. The light hit the wall where the sliding door had been. It was gone. Not just open, the entire frame was missing, replaced by a jagged hole in reality that led back into the warehouse. I swung the light to the side, searching for the chair where the reflection had been. The chair was empty, but the seat was soaked. A dark, viscous puddle was spreading across the floor, and in the center of the puddle was an old, beige telephone receiver, the one from extension 304. It wasn't connected to anything, yet the small speaker was emitting a wet, rhythmic gasping sound. "Open the door, Elias. Help me finish the call." The voice didn't come from the phone. It came from the shadows behind me. I spun around, the flashlight beam catching a glimpse of a pale, bloated hand retreating into the darkness of the rafters. I didn't stay to see more. I lunged out of the booth, hitting the concrete floor of the warehouse and running toward the main exit. But the warehouse had changed. The aisles of Sector 9 seemed to stretch for miles. Every time I turned a corner, I found myself back at the same row of industrial shelving. The smell of rot was growing stronger, and the floor was becoming slick with rising water. It wasn't rain. It was coming from the walls, seeping through the brickwork, bubbling up from the drains. I reached the steel door that led to the basement stairs. It was no longer bricked up. The bricks had been torn away from the inside, scattered across the floor like teeth. The door stood wide open, a gaping black maw that breathed out a mist of freezing vapor. I tried to run past it, but the water on the floor was now ankle-deep, thick and black like engine oil. Something grabbed my ankle, a grip like a band of frozen iron. I fell hard, the maglite clattering away into the dark. I felt myself being dragged backward, toward the open basement door. "No, Sarah, stop!" I screamed, clawing at the slick concrete. The dragging stopped at the very edge of the stairs. I rolled over, gasping, and saw her. She was crawling out of the basement, her limbs elongated and twisted, her sodden dress clinging to a frame that was more skeleton than woman. She leaned over me, her eyeless face inches from mine. "They bricked me in," she whispered, her voice a chorus of 1,000 drowning souls. "They listened to me die through the wire. Now, you listen." She grabbed my hand and pressed my palm against the cold, wet concrete of the basement wall. I felt it then, the vibration of 1,000 phone calls, the static of decades of loneliness, the sheer crushing weight of being forgotten. And then, the sound of the phone ringing. It was ringing inside my head. I don't remember how I got out. They found me at 6 a.m., wandering the parking lot in a catatonic state, my clothes soaked in black, foul-smelling water despite the sun being out for an hour. The warehouse was locked from the inside. When the police investigated, they found the basement door still bricked up, the dust undisturbed for 30 years. But they did find one thing. In the security booth, on the desk where I had sat, was the old beige phone. It had been melted, as if by extreme heat or a massive electrical surge. And on the handset, etched deep into the plastic, as if by a sharp fingernail, were the words EXT 304. Line open. I moved to a different state. I took a job in a bright, noisy office building. I thought I was safe. But last night I was working late. The office was empty. The sun had just gone down. My desk phone rang. I looked at the display. It was an internal call. I didn't answer. I grabbed my bag and walked toward the elevator. As the doors began to close, I looked back at my desk. The phone was still ringing, and sitting in my chair, her back to me, was a woman in a wet, floral print dress. She slowly began to turn her head. I don't work the night shift anymore. I don't answer phones I don't recognize. Because once you've heard the voice from extension 304, you realize the world isn't made of bricks and mortar. It's made of silence, and the silence is hungry. The next time you're alone in a quiet building and you hear a faint tapping on the wall, or a phone rings in a room that should be empty, don't be curious. Don't try to be the hero. Some secrets are bricked up for a reason, and some callers? They aren't looking for help. They're looking for company. Thank you for listening to tonight's account. If this story made your blood run cold, leave a 304 in the comments so I know who made it to the end. Don't forget to subscribe to Whispered Diaries for more true tales of the things that haunt the dark. And remember, keep the lights on.